We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Nicole Brisbane, and I am a project director at the Center for Public Research and Leadership at Columbia University. Welcome to CPRL's three-part learning series on student-led civic engagement. This series is designed to share district, teacher, and partner perspectives on how to prepare students to become active participants in our democracy. Today is the second part of our three-part series, and we will hear from teachers who are building the knowledge, skills, values, and motivations for civic engagement, as well as partners in the work. We hope today's discussion will be free of any tech glitches, but if you do need help, reach out to us in the question and answer box, and a member of our staff will be with you shortly. I'd like to welcome two educators to our panel today, Rob Markuske and Martin Mintz, and I'm going to have them share a little bit about their programs. So I think, Rob, why don't you kick us off?
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Robert Markuske. I am the Marine Affairs and Marine Policy and Advocacy teacher at New York Harbor School. The program focuses on a wide range of interdisciplinary approaches to the marine environment, marine ecosystems, marine careers, and all encompassing particularly into policy. And I guess I'll get more into other stuff later. It's complicated, so I'll get to that later.
Sorry, trying to find the. Oh.
Yeah, no, Martin.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I was trying to find my unmute button, but hi everyone. My name is Martin Mintz. Thanks for having me here. I'm the program manager at Generation Citizen New York. In my current role, I support our in-school programming for the New York region. I've been at GC for about 3 years now. Prior to joining GC, I spent 7 years teaching middle school social studies, mostly 8th grade, at a school in the Morrisania neighborhood in the Bronx. But Generation Citizen, we are a national nonprofit. Like I said, I work with the New York region, but our organization is working to transform how civics education is taught so that students are equipped and inspired to exercise their civic power. At the heart of our work is our Action Civics curriculum. The curriculum is a collaborative project-based approach to civics. So young people are learning about local government, learning about democracy, and how to use their civic power by actively working to address issues in their own communities. So it usually happens over the course of a semester in class, where students are choosing an issue that they care about, researching and developing a strategic plan to address their issue, and then taking action. So spending a good amount of the time actually putting their plan into action, and then reflecting on their successes and their challenges, and kind of thinking about what's next in their own civic journey. The semester usually ends with our Civics Day. Think of it kind of like a science fair for civics, where students are presenting their work to elected officials, to other students, to community members, and really have time to reflect on, all that they have been able to do and grow throughout the course of the semester.
Awesome, thank you. Kimberly, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Kimberly Austin, and like Nicole, I'm at the Center for Public Research and Leadership, and I will be the friendly face providing tech support should you need any for today. But I'm just really excited to join this conversation. Thanks, Nicole, for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you all again for being willing to join us. As I said at the top, my name is Nicole Brisbane. I'm at CPRL and also a former middle school educator. I was an ELA teacher, but had a strong focus on civic engagement in my classroom. So eager to dive into the conversation. So let us do a bit of a recap and talk about how we'll spend our time today. We will recap our working definition of student-led civic engagement and dive deeper into that definition that we started building in webinar 1. We will turn it over to our panelists to have a conversation about how student-led civic engagement has impacted their teaching and learning practice, as well as the impact that their programs have on students. Then we will invite you to join in the discussion and ask any questions that you have. You can use the Q&A box as those come up, and we will build them into our conversation. And then we'll close out today with a little bit of a preview to our next webinar that we hope you'll join us for. To begin, we want to explore how schools, districts, and partners can prepare students to be active participants in democracy. Student-led civic engagement is one approach that we see taking root and growing in school systems. Schools are increasingly asking, what is our role in preparing students to be active participants in democratic processes? There's no shared definition for student-led civic engagement as a holistic concept. So we reviewed the literature and met with practitioners and experts to think about what civic engagement and student-led teaching and learning means. And we've explored current iterations of civic readiness and civic engagement in schools, and really how it varies from earlier versions of civics education. After conducting this research, we created the working definition that you see here. In webinar 1, we used this definition to explore some of the structures that districts can put into place that create opportunities for student-led civic engagement in schools. And today, we're going to think about what knowledge, skills, values, and motivations are developed as a result of student-led civic engagement programs. To support that conversation, we would like to begin by unpacking these 4 concepts, which you see in our working definition. First, when teachers and experts think about the knowledge needed to be civically engaged, they often talk about a basic understanding of how political processes work, awareness of political ideologies, knowledge of universal rights, and the historical context that surrounds these concepts. This knowledge serves as the foundation for civic readiness. Second, we'll look at skills. In this context, skills refers to the competencies students need to engage in democratic processes. Researchers have identified many different skills, but they generally fall into 4 main categories. The first of these categories is collective decision-making, which highlights the need for problem-solving and conflict resolution. Communication, which refers to translating thoughts and ideas into words in order to influence change. Critical thinking, which refers to the ability to analyze and process information. And organization, which really involves planning, strategizing, and bringing people together to make a change. Now let's look at the third and fourth concepts, values and motivation. Student-led civic engagement creates opportunities for students to deepen an appreciation of values that enable participation in democracy. These values are civil discourse, free speech, and engaging those whose perspectives differ from your own. Last, we will look at motivations. Student-led civic engagement helps develop and deepen motivations for why young people should be civically involved. If you attended our first webinar, you may remember Heather Van Benthuizen from Chicago Public Schools explained that many students initially participate in civic engagement because of extrinsic motivations, like requirements for community service for graduation. However, student-led civic engagement creates opportunities for more intrinsic motivation, like building a passion for a cause or an issue, commitment to giving back to a community, or building skills for career development. In a moment, our panelists will discuss what development of these knowledge, skills, values, and motivations look like in classrooms. As this conversation unfolds, we invite you to use the Q&A to share any questions you have. To begin, we want to offer one example of what civically engaged students look like in action. Recently, students in Mr. Markuske's Marine Affairs and Marine Policy program provided testimony at a New York City Council hearing of the Committee on Sanitation and Solid Waste Management. In this April 2021 meeting, the committee discusses a package of bills related to achieving zero waste in New York City by 2030. We're going to watch a 2-minute clip of Jaden, a student in the Marine Affairs and Marine Policy program. Kimberly, are you all set up with the, okay, so I can flip over to you for that.
Does that look good for you, Nicole?
And Rob, I wonder if you could start by telling us what knowledge and skills does your program help students build that really get them prepared to do the sort of policy and advocacy work we just saw in that video clip?
Yeah, sure. So I guess what knowledge and skills does my program provide for them to be able to do that?
Yep.
Rephrase it. For myself, yeah, I mean, well, public speaking, of course, but also writing, but really something, I guess, what the program provides them is the agency that they're able to do that. Right. I think, Jaden is actually a naturally good public speaker, although he was a little nervous that day. I think one of the skills and sort of knowledge that they need is that they can do that, right? That they have access to testify at a city council hearing. So I think that that's the first step, is knowing that they're allowed in that room, right? They're allowed to submit a testimony. They're allowed to speak at those events. I think often at times with civic engagement, the students don't feel like they are at the table, right? So I think the first step is to show them the knowledge that they are allowed at the table. And if anything, they probably have a higher seat than most of us because they're the younger generation that will take over the city. As for the skills, we really try to instill public speaking as well as writing, right? So first the writing and then the public speaking. And that goes. I mean, it's constantly scaffolded. But I guess to end here is one skill that I try to instill in them is that they can do their own voice as well as their own revision. So something that I think that I try to instill in them is that this isn't my argument, right? It's their argument. So they have a little bit more ownership in developing the public speaking and the writing skills. If that makes sense.
Awesome. Thank you. Martin, let's go to you and let's talk a little bit about the knowledge and skills that students can develop as a part of Generation Citizen.
Yeah, for sure. So definitely a lot of what Robert was saying mirrors so much of what our students in Action Civics classes are seeing and the different experiences they have. I think for us during the semester, students are really working towards systemic policy aligned goals that address their focus issue in some way. Often they're large community issues that could look like, advocating for funding for homeless shelters, or, drafting and delivering testimony about protections for tenants, or advocating for or against, just bills in general. They could also be school-based ideas, like advocating for a stop sign in front of their school, or for more student voice in the school budget. But regardless of what they're actually doing, because some of these topics, are large and complex, and while we celebrate when students actually achieve their goals, we also know that the growth and the learning is in this process, and kind of shifting how we see success in the program. We often frame that the goal of this work is that process, and that if it were easy to achieve, a goal that you set out, the world might look like a different place. But like Robert mentioned, like agency is such a crucial part of this process, and thinking about, what skills, what opportunities are students taking? What do they have to, bring their own voices to, their own, to local government, or to kind of bring into this like civic space. And so, yeah, very similar to what Nicole had mentioned earlier. We also look at like civic skills, civic mindset, and civic disposition. We kind of put it in those three different buckets, but civic skills, thinking about sometimes a lot of those like soft skills, like, organizing, working in groups, public speaking, civic knowledge is, understanding what is the structure of local government, what is the structure of state level government, how do I identify decision makers and who holds political power. And that third piece, that civic motivation or disposition, really ties, I think, back to what Robert was mentioning too, about that agency and, seeing themselves as part of this process, and seeing how, there are ways that change can be made through the political system, and also what it takes to do that, the collaboration and compromise and things like that.
Awesome. We're going to switch the order and actually start with you, Martin, this time. So you started out teaching in the classroom. And when you think about the students that you had then, what motivated your students to be civically engaged or interested? And then follow that up with, how does Generation Citizens program think about building that motivation and investment in students?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the things that I think about when I look at student engagement, whether it's about civic engagement or just engagement in general, students, I think in my class, 8th graders, for the most part, like I mentioned, were really motivated by seeing themselves in their learning. And I think it's really essential to create those active learning opportunities, rather than passive learning. So much of what I did when that really kind of worked to increase student engagement was, again, that work around creating student-centered learning, project-based learning. And that also really reflects, kind of going back to Generation Citizen, reflects a lot of what happens as students are building their own civic power, and really relevant to the work that happens inside those classrooms that I'm now supporting. And again, like Rob had mentioned or kind of alluded to this earlier, a lot of what we see students kind of expressing that idea that, people in charge, or that the government isn't their space, or that, people in power wouldn't listen to them, or that their voice is not important in the civic context. Often they've internalized that, often they've experienced that. But this work that happens in GC kind of works to challenge that notion. So students are not just, developing a plan, but like we were able to kind of see in that testimony from Robert's class, you're seeing actual action being taken. Students are not just like saying, oh, what would I say if I had the chance to speak to somebody? You're actually taking the chance to speak to somebody. And there's so much value in that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Martin. When I was teaching, I think my students, also 8th graders, but I had 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, they felt like the concept of civics was actually history, right? Something that happened in the past. The concept of these dead people who founded this country on a set of ideals and documents that they did not see themselves as a part of. And so I was constantly trying to make learning relevant and connected to their lives today, right? Something that they could latch on to. Rob, your program focuses on marine and environmental advocacy and policy. What motivates your students to participate in this type of advocacy work? And where do you find yourself having to build that, that motivation in students?
Yeah, so, the course I teach, Marine Affairs, Marine Policy, and Advocacy, like I said in the introduction, it's a multidisciplinary course. And if you really sort of get into it, Marine Affairs is all encompassing, right? So what I try to do is have the students discover that, the marine affairs issues and marine policy issues are actually related to other things in their life, right? So, and it's actually, what I try to, what really gets the students going and sort of see it is in New York City, you could see all this stuff right in front of your face, right? You could see the inequities of food distribution. You can see the inequities of our food waste management systems. So, and, kind of what I tell them is that everything is related to our natural resources. Of course, our school focuses on the marine natural resources, but it's overall the environment. And environmental inequities is a real thing, right? People don't have access. It's just all these inequities exist, particularly in New York City. So, when students step out their door, regardless of where they're coming from in New York City, they see it, right? So that's sort of what I try to show them, is that it's right in front of their face, but it is a fine line, right? So I guess what I should say is I try not to make my arguments become their arguments, right? So I try to have them come up with their own argument in these marine policy and affair and environmental advocacy positions. And sometimes, right, but that's the whole nature of my course, right, is to show that we're all stakeholders in some position of our environment and our city and our civic life. And each student holds a different stakeholder position. So it's sort of up to them to sort of pursue what's good for their stakeholder, what's good for their sort of position, while also compromising and seeking sustainable uses and equitable uses of our marine resources. Yeah, like I said in the introduction, the course is very complicated, but really it just I try to get the students to see that they don't need to be A students to know this stuff, because it's really right in front of our faces, right? Like, they don't really have to go far to see the problems. And furthermore, because the problems sometimes they live, it's just now articulating those problems and seeking change is where the skills and the development come in.
Awesome. Rob, let's start with you for this one. One of the headlines of our series here is not just about civic engagement, but the concept of it being student-led. How do you manage to build in student voice and leadership in your program, where it seems like you're marrying that with some pretty complex, knowledges and skills and pieces of content that they need to know in order to really do this sort of advocacy work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question to answer. What I try to do is, in the world of advocacy and policy, this is my opinion. There's facts, right? Like, for instance, the testimony that you all saw, there were laws that were on the table, right? And I provided those laws to Jaden. And I gave him a scaffold of how to write a testimony, and that was it. And that's what he wrote. I had a fight with every fiber of my being to sort of help him with his testimony. But I think within my course, what I have done is, I don't know, it's hard. You got to try to find a common balance, right, between like supporting the students in sort of the more mechanics and grammar, but also stay away from editing their voice, right? So I think within my course, how I build in student voice and leadership is I give it to them, right? I stay away. And I think the pandemic has really sort of helped in that, because of the way we're Zooming and the way classes are run. I mean, the teacher-student hierarchy, I'll never go back to the way it used to be. So I think breaking down that hierarchy is super important. So the students, maybe not be peers as the teacher, but they feel that, like I said in the first answer, they feel comfortable enough to tell me to like step back, listen to me. So I think, once again, giving them that space and making them feel comfortable. But I do have to say, I have the joys of teaching my students for 3 years in a row. So it's like, that is something that I could only advocate for all teachers, is that you spend a lot of time, I spend a lot of time with my students to build that relationship, to allow them to feel comfortable enough to have their voice and take the lead on stuff. So, building a close relationship, I think, allows them feel comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. I looped with my students too. And there's certainly a relationship benefit to having, that continuity over time. And they definitely get comfortable telling you how they feel. Martin, let's flip to you and hear a little bit more about how students in the Generation Citizen model play a leadership role in the learning and advocacy there.
For sure. Yes. So, with Action Civics at the heart of that work, and it's really rooted in community, school community and classroom community, but also neighborhood and whatever lens that students decide to focus on. One thing that we have as a part of our curriculum is that students are advocating for something that is local. That could be something in terms of as hyper local as a classroom or a school, and could go all the way up to state level. But we definitely do advocate that they think about what does community mean, and that their action project actually solves or takes action towards an issue in their community. So I think through that process really engages young people to identify problems that are relevant to their lives, and not just talk about it, but take action in a real way. And in a way that therefore has impact around not just them, not just their classroom, but also their families, their neighborhood, their community. So really kind of builds that integrated into the work that's happening in the classroom, broadens it out into the larger community. So I think this work really does encourage students to make connections, beyond their coursework, beyond what they're doing day to day, and recognize the systems that are involved in community issues. So, we're not just looking at, pollution in a vacuum, but looking at, why does pollution happen? Who does pollution affect? Who does it affect disproportionately? So I think students are also digging into the different systems at play, and through that, developing their own leadership roles through taking action on that. So, it's a very guided process. Teachers have a lot of support through the curriculum and through us as program team. But, because it is so student driven, and students are kind of like the leaders of this work in terms of what they want to focus on, how they want to take action. There's never going to be a through line or an A to B way to take on this work. So really, we look at the educator's role as one of being helping and guiding and supporting students, but always making sure student voices at the center, at the forefront. And I'll also just mention that that idea of student leadership, student voice is just it's essential to that process of Action Civics. While the curriculum itself, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, the curriculum itself is that structure where students are going, lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3. The students themselves are in that driver's seat of deciding, what they're focusing on. And, a lot of what we see is the impact of that. We see, teachers and students are seeing that change. I think that's one thing that's really exciting about Action Civics is the impact that it can have, not just on the individual students, but on the school level and how schools see students as leaders. I think, a lot of our teachers are reporting out that having Action Civics in their school, deepens not just the educator's understanding, but school leadership's support of student voice beyond the classroom, leads to new opportunities for students to bring student voice to be heard at their school. And, we talk about something called a democratic classroom culture where all student values, or all students, all voices are valued. And one thing that's really exciting that we see is that, this kind of transcends the actual action project, but just also how are we looking at student voice? How are we looking at students as leaders within the school community, that kind of goes beyond just this one action project?
Yeah, that is a really great point, and one we heard in the first webinar from the folks who led the projects, the programs from the district level. you know, one of the things they thought about and focused on was the idea of schools as the democratic systems that we're preparing students to be participating in, and how mismatched that actually can look sometimes, where, you know, student participation is not as encouraged, or even, you know, action taken on some of the voice where they do allow students to play a role. You know, one of the things that you mentioned is just the critical role of the teacher in this process, where, you know, when I think back to my days in the classroom, you know, I had curriculum materials and then I had students, and my role was sort of connecting those two things together, whereas they felt oftentimes very far apart. And so teachers just play such a critical role in facilitating, you know, this work. What impact do you see the students having, you know, on their teachers and schools as a part of the projects that they take on?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly, you know, tied so closely to what I was, you know, elevating about this democratic classroom culture, because it really is focused around, you know, building school systems that value, not just value, but support student voices, and bring in their perspectives, but don't just stop at that, but also student influence, right? It's one thing to listen to a student and hear them, but what do you, like, what's next? And I think that's what a lot of the impact of action projects can have. So yeah, going back to this idea of democratic classroom culture, a lot of what we see in classrooms are teachers, you know, who go through this, notice that this process strengthens their relationships with students, positively impacts kind of how they see this concept of power sharing, right? When you give students a chance to take the leadership and support them throughout this process, you know, there's such value in that sharing of power. And also thinking about how this happens, not just on the classroom level, but on the school level. You know, a lot of class projects are specifically focused on, you know, school-based issues. You know, some of them, you know, maybe they're noticing that, you know, no student voice is on like the student leadership team or school leadership team, and they need to, you know, advocate for that. Or, you know, we don't have any sort of student government, so advocating for that. But just in general, even if the project isn't school-based, just this act of creating space and opportunity for students. One of the impacts really is that student voice is, you know, brought in throughout the school, through school leadership, you know, kind of beyond that classroom. So that's one of the big impacts that we see, which again, I think goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier about, you know, the impact or the goals of this work goes so far beyond, you know, did you achieve your action project goal or not? But what are you doing as you go through it as a student? But what are schools and how are they adapting to this idea of student-centered decision making and voice and power as they go through the course of this process?
Awesome, thanks, Martin. Rob, this question is for you. What have your students taught you about civic engagement?
Yeah, I think one thing I've learned from my students is it can't be forced, right? And it can't be like kind of what was just described. It can't be it's not just a school project, right? Like civic engagement and participating in advocacy isn't like a school project. It's a sort of like a lifestyle, right? To be an engaged citizen and to advocate for your community or advocate for others isn't just like a short-term thing, right? It's something that happens organically that they engage in long-term. And I think something else they've kind of taught me along those lines is with me, you know, I get very overly excited about the things that I get very excited. And they sort of they want to take it slow, right? These things are, like I said, you know, they're particularly the cohort that you saw in the video and that group of students that I've had for the past 2 years, right? They're in it for the long fight, right? This isn't like, you know, they're going to be no matter what they do after high school, they're going to be engaged citizens. So they're like kind of surveying the field, right? And they want to know what they're getting themselves into as they move forward throughout their college career or careers and jobs. So I think, to sum up what I'm saying is, they want to take it. I don't know. I've learned that my students want to sort of take it slow, right? They don't want to just go in fighting hard. They want to be ready when the fight comes, right? So like with that testimony, they prepared for a month or so in writing their testimony, although it was very short. But they also have an internship that focuses on organic waste. So their internship and their course and their testimony was all very much related. So that, I've learned that the students they want to take it slow, right? And they want to learn things piece by piece. So when they do sort of step up for this grand affair of civic engagement, they're prepared, right? They want to be prepared for like the main event, right? Because they don't want to fail, right? Because particularly, I guess I could quote one of the students that we didn't see, but she, before we went into the testimony via Zoom, we met up and she was like, so if they pass these laws, I can say that I advocated and they listened to me and they passed the law. I was like, yeah, you could say that, along with your other teammates. And, that was, she's like, all right, we're ready for that. Right. So I think what I've learned is they want to be prepared, right? They want to know the knowledge. They want to use their life experiences, but they don't want to make a decision when it comes to civic engagement based on emotion, right? They want to know all the facts. They want to know all the perspectives, every stakeholder's position before they advocate for something that may not be, I think, something that I guess it goes into this, what I was saying that I learned is they don't want to advocate for something that they fear is going to harm somebody else. So they want to be truly, before they go into something, they want to know all perspectives. And that's something I learned, right? From them is that it's my job to show them all perspectives. But with that said, what I've also learned from them is that I don't show them their perspective, right? Like I can't assume what my students' thoughts or feelings are on any particular matter, right? Like I can't assume because we teach at an environmental school, they all are on the left of the political spectrum. So what I've learned from them is that I need to help them prepare for their advocacy and civic engagement. And I can't assume what their beliefs are, right? Because I think what you can tell is that what I try to instill in my students is that it's very complicated. So how you feel on one issue may be different than another, and right, this ongoing sort of intersectionality of all these issues. Yeah, that's what I learned from my students, that this is extremely complicated.
I love it. I want to bring others into the conversation. If you all have any questions, again, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. Kimberly will let you monitor that in the event that any of them come in. Feel free to jump in. But I'll share a quick story from my classroom in the meantime. One of my students, I think it was probably in the process of us talking about a piece of poetry that was written by somebody from the community that where my school was from. We were talking about the idea of local advocacy for something that was happening in the community. The park behind the school was closing down, and they were really upset about the issue. And I think from an adult perspective, sometimes we know through experience how things happen and how changes get made and how these issues take shape. And because of life experience, we are sort of ingrained to have an opinion about what's sort of happening. And then one of my students said to me, Miss Brisbane, don't forget that my mama still wakes me up every morning. I was like, but his point to me was that I'm still a kid, and my parents for the most part drive all of my my entire life. And so this concept of agency is one that has stuck with me, and one that I'm glad came up in the conversation today, because it's so interesting to think about how to build agency, to your point, Rob, without teaching students what their perspective should be, right? About how to help them develop that agency on their own. So it looks like we've got a question. Kimberly, do you want to share it with us?
Yes, happy to do so. So this question is from Anna, and it's really asking both Martin and Rob to sort of think about what is the intersection between the work that you do and building more equitable schools?
I'm happy
Martin,
to.
Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, happy to answer first. Yes, I think that's actually really at the heart of a lot of work that we do inside of our organization. I think we look at it a few different ways. Part of it's just, how does the curriculum itself advance equity? But there's also work that we're doing as an organization that is focused on how do we advance equity in education through civics on the larger scale. I think at the heart of this work itself, I think when topics themselves are determined by students and obviously come from diverse perspectives, and they're actually in and of itself taking action around issues that they care about. I think inherently a lot of times projects are actually taking action specifically around inequitable systems. But I think to speak to the kind of larger topic of building equitable implementation of civic education in schools, that's one thing that we as an organization are focused around a lot. And we really think, actually recently had a white paper that came out that really focuses around equity in civics. And there were three kind of main issues that we work towards. The first is just, and again, I think super center to this work itself, is centering student voices. I think that's something that we have, constantly been a theme during, over the past hour. But, I think equitable civics, it's students are being able to represent themselves, their voices, their perspectives, and again promotes, the ability for students to share their own lived experiences and perspectives to engage around specific social issues. The other things that we focus around are just parent or caregiver engagement. So finding ways to, make sure that adults are also brought into this. So when we talk about civics education, it doesn't just stop at the student. And then the last one we think about is just, how do districts or states or cities fund civics? A lot of what we think about at Generation Citizen, recently New York State passed the pilot for the Seal of Civic Readiness. One thing that we focus around too is, how is the funding for civics education going to be equitable and allow for all educators, not just the ones who might have more funding, to bring this into their work. That's one thing that we see as essential to this is, not only creating the opportunities, but also creating the support and the funding, so that we're not, again, leaving teachers to kind of hold that bag to figure out how it works, but that these systems at play are also working to support the implementation of real engaging civics education.
Rob?
Yeah, I get same question, right? Which one? What is the intersection between the work you do and building more equitable schools? Yeah, I think, and I wanted to answer the second question that was just posted too. I think the work that what brings to mind is an example, right? I teach at a career technical school, and every year at this time we have to pitch our programs to the prospective ninth graders to join our program. And students always ask, what type of student are you looking for? and all I say is open-mindedness, right? And they're like, well, what skills do I need? I'm like, well, it doesn't matter. Like we'll learn those skills later. Um, so I think that part of the work that the program that I teach does is sort of breaks those. I think it's really important to break down those traditional barriers that our systems have set forth, right? And I think, right, say it again, like the pandemic is sort of with the testing kind of going away. So I think a lot of these standards and expectations that have been set forth within our education system um, need to be challenged, right? So I think as a teacher, if I challenge them, the kids sort of see that, right? And then they latch onto it. And I'm not saying just like, fight the man, fight like, just challenge for the sake of challenging. I think as an educator, we have to make it very clear to the students that we also see the inequitable systemic problems, and that we're also engaging in making it better. I think just kind of reinforcing the status quo and the same old expectations and standards isn't sort of helpful for them, because it just perpetuates the cycle. So I don't know. Can I answer the next question that was there too? Yeah, it says if all right, yeah. What were some ways school administrators can support and encourage them if there are some of their proposals and suggestions can't be achieved immediately? Well, the first thing I would be asked is why can't they be achieved, right? I think that's what like something as an administrator or like ask yourself why can't it be achieved? Because I often find as a teacher at my school who also is a sustainability coordinator, often at time those things can't be achieved. And I'm not criticizing you because I don't know you, and that would be wrong with me. Or I'm talking about from my current situation. They're often not achieved because of misshapen priorities or allocation of funding. And so that is what should be asked, right? Like, why can't these things be achieved? Because they should be, right? Particularly when it comes to student proposals. I think that time and time again, I've seen in schools, particularly my school, students propose something and it doesn't get through, but then the PTA does, then it goes through. So I think that sort of listening to your students first and asking yourself why it can't be achieved, and so to get to the root of why that's not a possibility is a good way to start, I feel.
Martin, do you want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, for sure. I think, first off, I'll definitely just echo, so much of what Robert was saying, I think is really rings true. And I think about a lot of the school-based projects that students take on through a Generation Citizen. And I think a lot of it too is, to Rob's point, is having conversations, right? I think students, for the most part, ideas that they have, or if it's necessarily the idea, the concern, having a conversation around that concern, and also just sharing, with students the realities. So, sharing perspective on, oh, so this is why we have this policy that currently exists, right? This is, this is the state mandate that we're following, or, this was our thinking behind creating this policy that you're trying to change, and actually engaging in that conversation. I think again goes back to this idea of how our schools building a culture of respecting student voices, respecting student experiences, and creating space for them. And that's something that we've heard time and time again. Schools that have been working with Generation Citizen are developing that, if it didn't already exist, as students are setting up meetings with their principal or advocating for themselves. It's also just beyond themselves. I'll also mention that, right? Students might address an issue because it's affecting them and their students, or they see a policy that they don't notice is fair, they don't think is fair. But also so much of, and this is something that I'm struck by a lot, is that students are also understanding that it takes time, and they still want to do it, right? Maybe they're a class of seniors advocating for a policy change for their school. Maybe they have the understanding, yeah, this, I'm a fall semester senior, I might not have the benefit of this. But that doesn't really, it's for so many of the examples that I've seen, doesn't impact, the importance of it and students' determination to take on those projects. So I think that actually also speaks to, valuing students and kind of what we expect, from this work. It's trying to just better a school environment. So I think that in and of itself, listening to students, valuing those student experiences, and then as a school, asking yourselves, like, okay, so why, like, what are they saying as a school? And then what can be developed if it's not now? Sharing that message of, it is also that importance of, you're not just changing things for yourself, but it's about working within those systems and those communities.
And I think as we wrap up the conversation, I think important to note that on webinar 1, we heard from Christina Ross, who was from Baltimore Public Schools, from the administrator perspective, that oftentimes what they do when this problem arises is that they share the sort of like state or federal law that is providing maybe some of the constriction, and then maybe whatever, local city ordinance is also maybe providing a constriction, and then within the parameters of what the school does have in its locus of control, they ask students to think about the change that is sort of possible within the school's purview. So really sharing some of those additional outside restrictions with students to sort of pull back the curtain on why a change or a policy is the way it is. And so I want to make sure that we sort of share some key takeaways from today's discussion, because I had the privilege of chatting with these two gentlemen before the conversation today, and just capture some of the things that came up in conversation. I think what you heard from both Rob and Martin is just the really strong focus on student agency and student voice, not just in the sort of execution of the program, but also in the design of the program. Really understanding the school and the program's role, in providing that knowledge and those, skills to get students to the point where they are understanding and owning their agency. Really thinking about civic engagement and education as an opportunity to deepen content knowledge across subjects, as well as this being interdisciplinary, not just reserved for social studies classes, but opportunities to have students build this engagement across all subject areas. And we had the benefit of hearing from both a homegrown program like Mr. Markuske's program, that is, really something that he runs and leads at the Harbor School, as well as partners like Generation Citizen that can help schools build in action civics into their school programs. And then I want to just quickly note that we will be sharing some resources after today's event where you can learn more about Generation Citizen and Mr. Markuske's Marine Affairs and Policy program. So look out for an email from us on with some additional resources to dive into. And then just as we quickly wrap up, I wanted to make sure folks knew that in our final installment of this webinar series, we will be back to our lunchtime hour next Wednesday. We will hear from the New York State Department of Education as they talk about their Civic Readiness Initiative, which Martin talked a little bit about today. So we're excited to hear more about them, more about that program next week, as well as hearing from the Democratic Knowledge Project at Harvard University, which will share some frameworks and resources with us so that folks can go ahead and build their programs. We really hope you will join us for our final installment, and we look forward to seeing you. Thank you again to our guests for joining us today. We really enjoyed having you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thanks so much. It's great talking with you all.